So thank you and welcome to our first session of the GEL virtual series for April. My name is Dan Sayapon and I'm the Director of Global Experiential Learning, or GEL. GEL integrates travel, multicultural education, and service learning to provide diverse and inclusive opportunities for all University of Arizona students. We did not have a chance to travel this past year, but when we could, we learned about the places by exploring the culture, history, and people. And similarly, I hope we can learn from our topic today around George Floyd and racial justice, which are large pieces of the true culture, history, and people of what we call America. Before we get started with this important conversation, I want to thank all the panelists that are joining us today, and for Dr. Regina Delamen and Dr. Nolan Cabrera for helping to coordinate this dialogue. And when she comes, I would also like to thank and invite Associate Vice Provosts of Diversity and Inclusion, Ivy Banks, to give the opening remarks when she joins us in this conversation. So I'll turn it over to Ivy.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us. This week, many of us sat in anxiety, not knowing what would happen with the verdict. And as I was sitting there and had so much anxiety, so much concern, even though my eyes told me that a member of our community, a Black man, was murdered right in front of children in elementary school children, the fact that we still had to question whether or not his murderer would be found guilty means that we have some work to do. It means that we haven't arrived in the space where we can truly think about being in an inclusive world. It was really hard because history is replete with these periods of hope that follow events and these kumbaya moments, but they don't last. They're not sustainable. We talk about these ideas with tactics on what we're going to do in order to change, whether it be our campus or to change our own personal relationship with racism and systemic oppression. But what we experience as reality is that those moments are fleeting. And as soon as it's removed from our social media feed, then our institutions, our entities that's supposed to be doing this complex work, it seems to fail. So how do we think about the moving forward after the George Floyd? What does that look like in a post-George Floyd world where we don't have to sit in anxiety and wonder if a person that murdered a Black man in full daylight, captured on multiple cameras, will be convicted? And so I'm hoping that as we start to think of this post-George Floyd verdict world, that we're starting to think about how we can sustain and hold ourselves accountable for what we said when we saw it, for that moment when we felt like we really had to do something. For many of us in the Black community, we're hyper visible yet invisible. You see me, but you don't see me. There's this, if you go to the Louvre in Paris, and Beyonce and Jay-Z had this in their video, Ape Shit. And what they showed was they stood in front of the Mona Lisa. Everybody understands and says that name, Mona Lisa, Mona Lisa. And at the end of the video, they showed a beautiful art that's very similar, that looks very similar, but it's of a Black woman, and it's called The Portrait of a Negress. When we talk about being hyper visible and yet invisible, it is the person who painted that picture knew her name. The person that owned her knew her name. And yet it's going down in history as the portrait of the Negress. The reason why we have called upon our community to say, remember his name, remember her name, say it, is because so long our Black men and our Black women that have been killed, that have faced violence, their memory fades when our social media changes into another headline story. So I'm hoping that this is the time, that this is the moment where it's not just a period of hope or a period of kumbaya moments, but that we really are thinking about what we promised in 2020 is what we're going to continue to do in 2021, 2022, 2023, because we have not arrived. Although we see a woman of color as the vice president, we still watched 3 members of the Black community get killed in the past week, right in front of our eyes. I'm hoping that as we move forward and have this conversation, we can talk about sustainable change, and we can talk about how the overwhelming battle fatigue and racial trauma faced in our Black and other communities of color is not a fad. It is reality, and it needs to be addressed as one of the greatest challenges of our society. Looking forward to this conversation.
All right. Wow, those are powerful opening words. Thank you so much for offering those. So really quickly, just so that y'all know who's on the panel, real quick, there will be a new assistant professor, Don Debs, who's coming down from ASU and will be starting in the fall, but she will be joining us. She can't join us until 4 o'clock, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention her here. She'll be starting off as assistant professor in ed leadership. But if everyone can go around just really quick introduction, name, title, where you're at, and then I'll get to the actual question. So Tricia, if you don't mind starting us off, please.
Yeah, I'm very happy to. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tricia Brand, she, her pronouns, and I am talking with you from Portland, Oregon. I'm at Portland Community College.
Beautiful.
Sorry, and I serve as the Chief Diversity Officer for Portland Community College.
Oh, just that little role. All right. So Intari, if you could go next, please. Oops, you're muted.
My name is Intari Ali Galt, and I'm an adjunct professor transitioning to a lecturer in the Africana Studies Department at the U of A. And a lot of this is my study. My study is Black masculinity. And I've had these experiences. So this is something that's just on time for me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you being on this panel. And last but not least, Jenny, if you don't mind introducing yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Lee. I'm a professor of higher education in the same department as Nolan, Educational Policy Studies and Practice. Much of my work is on international higher education scholars and mobility.
Wonderful. All right. So as Ivy was saying, we want strategies for social transformation, but we're also wanting some strategies for self-preservation amidst all of this. So my first question to the panel is if you could let folks know briefly some of the work that you've been doing around healing, activism, solidarity work amidst all this intense racialized violence. Just some of the ways that you've been engaging in the community and doing that. Within the follow-up about this is more about out there, and then the follow-up will be about your self-care. So you can either volunteer or be voluntold.
I'm happy to volunteer because I don't like being voluntold. So I'm going to jump on in really quickly. It's a wonderful way to start our discussion and dialogue in terms of, number one, thinking about what either activism and or collective engagement, how that represents a form of care, a collective care for the community, but also a way in which we can continue to push toward progress. And I think that's been really challenging in this time of pandemic, because in a lot of ways, there's been this compression of the idea of self-care when most of our community is really hurting. Most of our community continues to experience daily indignities and, in so many instances, violence and death. And so the idea of what it means to come together and think about how we create healing spaces, but also healing spaces that don't just stop at caring for one another, but looking for ways to build bridges for how we can prevent this kind of harm in our community going forward. That's the goal. And we know that it's going to still take generations. And that's what's hard. Even as I think about students who are here and wanting to come and be together in this space, you want to act right now. And you also know that every act that you take, it takes something from you, it takes something from someone else in your circle, and it can really be exhausting. But some of the things that we've been doing at Portland Community College, and I've been really grateful for some of the space, around July, decided to specifically center Black employees at the college. And we had never actually had a resource or an affinity space dedicated strictly to Black faculty and staff. We've had a network for all of our BIPOC or staff and faculty of color at the institution, but had never actually created and curated a space just for Black faculty and staff. And so we did that, and I've been leading that group monthly, and we spent 3 months just focusing on healing and transformation and talking about what it meant for our college to be more welcoming to our Black employees and what it would mean to create more understanding of recognizing sort of the additional tax that was being taken, the toll that was being taken on faculty and staff who were still trying to show up every day and lead meetings and support students and be there for them, but also to manage all of the additional experience and weight of the world. So that's been really a critical kind of emerging thing that we've done. The other thing I just wanted to mention very quickly that's sort of on the other spectrum is we've expanded what we would call white ally spaces. We've added additional white ally spaces, and now we're actually creating what we're calling white advocate spaces. And we're doing some specific curriculum work to really get our white allies to step up and kind of stand in the void in some very meaningful ways. That's happening this year. My hope is that next year we can have those spaces connect with spaces with communities of color and have some really important intergroup dialogue. But that's been really something I've been super proud of. It's been really hard work, but it's at least provided a space for people to feel heard and to feel supported, and also for us not to just be supporting ourselves, but really requiring, as Vice President Banks mentioned earlier, more accountability in our community. And like the white ally space is a critical part of that.
Okay, mental note, we want to replicate that at the U of A as best we can. So I'm going to steal your idea, but give it proper attribution. Also, to the folks in the audience, we are going to have time, obviously, for Q&A or even just dialogue discussion. But if things do pop up while we're in the first part of the discussion, please feel free to drop it in the chat. We can either see how to incorporate it in or leave it for the end at that end part. So, Antari, do you mind going next?
When this all started, what was really strange is that I was in my first semester teaching in the spring of 2020. And then we started having, Ahmaud Arbery, and we were having all these discussions in class. I mean, my first day of class, I started out with the death of Kobe Bryant. and here I am, I'm a brand new professor, and my class is totally disillusioned because here's this basketball player that they all grew up with. And then we had Ahmaud Arbery, and then we had Breonna Taylor. We started, all these started to go together, that the names almost were combined. And at the same time, a pandemic hit, and we had to go remote learning. I had to learn Zoom. I had never even heard the term before. Now I had to learn Zoom, and as I'm teaching, and I was teaching Intro to Africana Studies, and immediately I started doing a transition. I said, I have 50 some students in my class, 4 Black. What is my role here? My role is to decentralize the European existence in this study, and to centralize Black folks in the study, Africana Studies. And immediately I told them terms like third world, not allowed in my class. we're getting rid of that. And I explained to them what third world is, and we went through other terms that were natural for them. And I said, well, it's not natural for me because that's not my raising. And so I started to challenge them. What have they been learning? What have they been learning about through this class? What have they been learning in the news? What and now write me papers. Don't just talk about it. Don't just tell me what. So I did a quick transition to my whole syllabus, and now tell me what's going on, and with you in this whole time of the pandemic and all these things that we're seeing in the media. And that's where the true challenge came from. And the answers that I started getting back were remarkable. There was some resistance initially, but I even had one that sticks out in my mind, a lawyer, somebody who's going to school for law, who explained that this made him change the entire way that he thought about law. And he said that now he's starting to understand what the Black experience is a little bit in America, and he has to approach law different than the entire way that he is expecting to. So and so that's where I've seen it help with, and I've been getting many of those papers back, and I'll respond a little bit more as we go along.
Okay, beautiful, thank you. And that's care right there. That's community care, and also, but like you said, challenging and decentering white norms in the process of all this critically important stuff. Jenny, what have you been doing? Yours is a slightly different context.
Yeah, and I know we're running a bit over time, so I'll keep this one short and expand later. But basically, I'm here in solidarity with you all. I was so moved by what you said, and what I'm really terrible at doing is staying in my own lane. And especially when I share, I can't pretend and say I know, but I do know what it means to be afraid, to be angry, to feel betrayed, to feel invisible, to feel unheard, to feel powerless. That's what I understand, and that's what brings me here. But in terms of the work I do, I've been in South Africa for almost 8 years now, doing a lot of work with Black African students and about the diversity of the continent. So again, I don't, I'm an Asian woman who likes to be in Africa because I find that there's so much common ground and also because I'm here to learn. I'm here to learn from this panel, but wherever I go, I seek to learn and I seek to find connections to my own work so that we don't stay in our lanes. So that's why I'm here, but I'm happy to share more in the upcoming questions.
Beautiful, thank you. And we're getting close. We're almost caught up to our timeline. We want to make sure so we're good. I appreciate y'all rolling with the punches on that. So this was the first question, again, was more about community support, care, trying to really challenge systems, but then on an individual level, and no, please don't, if you don't want to answer this is fine because it's a personal question, but the issue of self-care is always thrown out there, but it's very, very rarely defined. And sometimes it becomes kind of this bougie notion of like, we're going to go have a spa day or something like that. But like authentic self-care, have you been able to engage in it? And B, if so, what are you trying to do in order to deal with this consistent barrage of racial trauma?
I think I'll take this one. The tough thing is, this is something that didn't just come overnight for me. Dealing with racial trauma, I'm about to turn 54 in July. I've been dealing with racial trauma for almost 54 years. I remember being the 18-year-old and having the police surround a car that I was sitting in with their guns drawn and literally told not to move, and then being yelled at because I only had my college ID, and so why don't you have a driver's license? I'm in the back seat. I don't need a driver's license in the back seat. And being yelled at because I had a photo album. Why do you have a photo album? Because I'm showing pictures to my friends. Oh, so you're smart. apparently smarter than you are right now. And I did make that statement, and my friends was like, that you almost just got a shot. And so how do I deal with that? What's my coping mechanism on things I've been dealing with forever? I mean, not to be cliched, sometimes it's just put on a whole bunch of gospel music, locking myself in a room, my office. Sometimes it's sitting down watching my daughter's cartoons that is so far away from my life. Watching Friends, which is once again so far away from my life. That's my coping mechanisms, is I have to find something that is so far away where I can not think about the trauma of when I get in my car. Yesterday, my father and I were driving in the car and having the police pull up behind me, and the feeling that went in my chest. So those are some of the things that I have to do for my coping mechanisms.
Got it. Anybody else? Thank you so much. And I appreciate that, because like all too often in higher ed, we're in this heady space, and I appreciate y'all being open and vulnerable in this hard space. So I really value and respect that. So if there's anyone else who would like to chime in on that.
Yeah, I think I want to build upon, what Dr. Galt was talking about. And I think especially this idea of what it means to bring a lot of the cumulative aspects of the trauma into the space, right? So we're dealing with what's a real acceleration, but for so many, there have been flashpoints for so long. And in many cases, when you ask someone like, when did you first have awareness that you were Black or brown? It's usually around a traumatic event, right? So there's a lot that we hold. But I'll just say this, I live in Oregon, and I will say, it is beautiful. There are a lot of trees. There's beautiful ocean. Getting out in nature is the way to go. And I will also say that there aren't a lot of Black folks who get a chance to really engage that and do it in a way where you really reclaim our own relationship to nature. And so it's been great to do that, both myself, sometimes with my partner, sometimes with friends, getting out in nature. It's been a wonderful way to be in a healing space and to take advantage of the beauty of where I live.
I'll add on as well. I center myself on family. I have a very, very close relationship with my family. My great grandmother, born in 1902, who lived to be nearly 100 years old, and the wisdom that she carried. So being able to share the power of the Black community with my children. So they were impacted. I have 3 boys, and of course I worry that they will also be pulled over, as well as my husband. And so part of the coping and the wellness was centering ourselves in the rich beauty of the Black community and the Black culture, cooking soul food and enjoying a soul food meal on Sundays, centering our stories that we read to them at night on how Black men are kings and that they can achieve. So recentering a lot of the experiences so that my children can see the power and beauty in Blackness.
See, this is why it's such an honor to be able to facilitate this panel, because, we start off with self-care as, I'm going to go get my nails done. And we come to community, culture, family, and nature. See, that's what self-care is about. I really appreciate y'all offering that. So then moving to more specific. So, Intari, you already started talking about this a little bit. In your approach to your classes, but specifically, and I hope I'm not talking out of turn, that what I'd heard is that it wasn't just that you were bringing up these issues in class, but you're really having students incorporated into assignments, writing about it, using critical reflection as a method of processing. So I hope I'm hearing this correct, and if I'm not, please let me know. But then also, how is that method is probably too crude a word, but bear with me. So how is that approach helping students to process these really traumatic times?
Remarkably, some of them, and first I'll start with some of the my students of color. Some of them, they have no relation to this. They grew up in a middle class environment, and so I share a lot of my history, my background. I've done several interviews, and they've watched interviews that I've done different places, and then they're like, I mean, some of them actually in class just broke down and started crying and said, now all of a sudden they're hearing their father's stories. And they said that they kind of put their father's story like, well, you know, parents are always going to exaggerate. Parents are always going to have this, you know, horrifying story. You know, like about, you know, I walked 20 miles in my bare feet one way to school, you know, and that's the way they took their parents as. But now all of a sudden they hear their professor telling the same type of stories, and and I've seen them embody my story, and which is amazing. And they've gone back and talked to their own parents and their fathers specifically, and say, okay, now that I've heard my professor tell the story, and I explained to them, I haven't always been a professor. I just completed my dissertation, you know, back in 2019, and I tell them you know, I was an assistant manager at Payless Shoes. You know, like, I was a slam poet. You know, like I got held up at gunpoint at one point at work. I went to the worst high school in Buffalo. I went to the two worst high schools in Buffalo, and so whatever perception you have about your professor and how easy it was for your professor, lose it, because that was not my life. So, and that helps them. And I also teach them, in 100 years, they'll be studying 2020 and 2021. They're going to be studying the quarantine and the pandemic, just like we were talking about the Spanish flu. They're going to be studying this spate of police violence on Black people because it was recorded. Like we're studying the civil rights movement, like we studied Tulsa. These are all things happening at the same time right now. You're in the middle of history. What is your view now? And when you present it like that, it seems like they're saying, oh, okay, so this is not me studying a long time ago. This is me talking about right now and what I'm seeing and the stories that I'll be able to tell. And they write from that perspective. And I've been amazed by what they've been saying. I've been amazed by all of their reflections.
Oh, and that's tough, because seeing the relevance of this time space that we're in while we're in it is an incredibly difficult, really important thing to do. Switching gears a little bit. So Trish, you already alluded to that you not alluded, you said directly that, you know, you're coming from Portland, and let's just say things were a little tense in Portland this past summer, just a little bit. But you know, in some respects, for whatever reason, Portland became known as like ground zero for, you know, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, Proud Boys, like, but you know, I guess if you could just kind of reflect on your experience in that, and also, you know, please feel free to use this as an opportunity to just set the record straight, like, you know, what was really going on, because, you know, we know from the media, if it bleeds, it leads. So there's always that kind of an angle that they really want that smashed window to highlight it because it does good ratings. So yeah, if you could just you know, talk about that, and then, you know, how the George Floyd's murder and the Derek Chauvin trial sort of was playing out in that. So I know there's multi-layers. Just pick out the little nuggets that you want to address in that.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Nolan. You know, I have to say it has been, especially in the last maybe 15 months in particular, it sort of felt like I was watching a movie that I was a main character for, but I wasn't necessarily scripted into the movie. And I'll come back to that in just a second as an analogy, because there is a history there, and especially in regards to the way in which Portland has several histories, a very recent history of being extremely engaged, sort of politically and cause-wise. This is a very cause-driven kind of city. It attracts cause-driven individuals to come and to engage and to create a lot of their own ideas of how to create change in their community. We have so many different nonprofits and other organizations that sometimes all it takes is two people to say, this is what we want to do. And you can kind of get into the game here in Portland. And I do appreciate the fact that we're such a cause-driven community. But I have to acknowledge here, and I'll come back to kind of setting the record straight. We have been the place where all of the most critical contention has been around kind of evil versus good, connected to the Proud Boys. That's been going on for several years. Our anti-fascists, our growing number of anti-fascist kind of members, folks who either believe that they are organizing in the name of anti-fascism or they are affiliated in some way, continues to grow. And that really spiked after the 2016 election of Donald Trump. And we continue to have to engage around what that has meant for this city to see themselves as both a target for white supremacists to engage, as well as a place where we have to constantly show that there are good white people who live in Portland. And so I'm going to say that and kind of come back to this other history, which is the recognition that Oregon has its own very clearly documented and still persistently kind of racist, racialized history. The state itself was founded, and the constitution of the state very clearly articulated it was an exclusionary state. It was designed to be a white utopia. It was designed to primarily not have Black residents settle who were migrating out of the South or re-migrating from other parts of the country. It continues to struggle to navigate its history related to internment and imprisonment, particularly of who they identified as all non-residents of Oregon, but of course, historically and persistently, it was primarily Japanese American and Chinese American residents. These are real touchstones of Oregon's history that then led to so many other touchstones of ways in which we never did the right thing as a state to address and reckon our own history. We had an opportunity. This was not a slave-holding state. This is a state that also has one of the largest urban and rural Native Nation and Indigenous residents, right, in the entire region. There have been all of these opportunities to really reckon with that history, and we've not really reckoned with the history. And so I really think that a lot of what you see right now related to Portland, there's an amazing image of one of our bridges. We're also known as a bridge city. We have several bridges. One of our bridges, the Burnside Bridge, had over 10,000 people laying on the bridge 3 nights after George Floyd was murdered. And we had one of the longest consecutive protest runs kind of through last summer. And when you look around, you see that it's 85% white. And that's both really, really encouraging, truly remarkable. And there's also something underneath, which is, what does it mean to really have to confront, for maybe the first time, the realization that putting a Black Lives Matter sign on your lawn, being affiliated with Antifa and wanting to engage against white supremacists, all of those actions are really important. But if we aren't really ready to reckon with things like gentrification and displacement of community after community after community, then we're still not really in a place to truly become the kind of Portland, Oregon that many of our residents want to believe that we are. So we have a long way to go. But this to me is a wonderful space to continue to sort of have those conversations as to let's talk about what's motivating so many in our community. And I think that that has a lot to do with it.
Wow. You just gave a socio-political history of from Whitelandia to Portlandia in 4 minutes. That's impressive. But thank you for not only your thoughtful response, but also you setting the record straight on that. Because again, you know, it was disheartening to see, and there were motivations to see so many of the narratives that we're wanting to have and around, you know, Portland is descending into chaos and an anarchist city. And, you know, it's good to hear from people on the ground. I was hearing similar reports from my family who's back in Oregon, the same thing, that like, yeah, it's important, but A, the beautiful protest is not being covered nearly as much. And B, that it's not as widespread as people are making it out to be. It's not like the city under siege in that way. All right. So then shifting gears one more time. So we've gone to more of a national context. Now I want to hit upon an international context. And so Jenny, you've been, as you said earlier, that you've been in South Africa for the last 8 years. You know, and so initially I posed the question to you that, you know, what are people in South Africa saying around George Floyd's murder, Derek Chauvin's trial, Black Lives Matter, any of the social unrest that's been going on here locally. And then you said, I'll see you and raise you. And you went back to find some folk or a colleague of yours who's in South Africa who you wanted to offer some sentiments that they had as well. So whatever you have on the subject, whatever they have on the subject, please enlighten us. Let us see this issue from an international lens.
Thanks, Nolan. And I just want to thank Dan for organizing this session. I appreciate that it's under GEL as a global issue, because I think that offers us tremendous encouragement that the world is watching and the world is inspired. From Asia to Scandinavia, of course, Africa, Eastern Europe, the verdict made national headlines across the world. And regardless of all these analyses, because we're a critical bunch, this was a huge celebration for what it was. It also gave people a voice and license to call out injustice. So, you know, whether it is in Portland or in Tucson or in Cape Town, South Africa, these have tremendous ripple effects. And I know sometimes in the US, we don't see this because it doesn't make CNN. Well, the things we're doing in US CNN does make international CNN. So I just wanted to encourage you all with that. But, you know, I just, there were so many times I try to find someone else because I'm really not in a place to speak on behalf of, you know, Black Lives Matter or even South Africa. So I tried my best to get a Black South African scholar who wasn't able to make it. It's not, you know, this is like the middle of the night, but I did capture a quote that she gave me permission to share. So if that's all right, this is just her response when she found out the verdict. It's a huge victory for the majority of Black South Africans, including myself. It really resonated with us, apartheid and all. And now it feels like we've been vindicated for so many cases that have gone unresolved and still do. We feel we still continue to live in apartheid under the Black government and face Black police brutality. Floyd's case deeply resonated, and we wish things should be similar in the outcome in our case. So it's been perceived as a victory across the board. There's a man by the name of Collins Kosa, who is the George Floyd of South Africa, who now is being, you know, that his name is coming up more and more in the fight for racial justice. I don't know if any of you were familiar, but there was also a South African in Hawaii who was killed by the police under alleged misdemeanor. So yeah, this is happening to internationals. This is happening internationally. So clearly the fight lives on. I think as much as possible, you know, to find these interconnections. But I think if I was to say anything in this short amount of time is to say, keep doing what you're doing, because you have no idea how many people you are inspiring beyond your immediate neighborhoods. And I think it's pretty mind-blowing to see how this amazing movement just took off globally. peacefully, but also in the midst of COVID. And I think that's an inspiration for all of us who are doing activist work.
God, that's beautiful. That is so beautiful. Thank you, Jenny, for sharing that. And I also really respect the, the humility of positionality, sort of, like you said, wanting to be in solidarity in different ways, but saying, I want you using your space to amplify folks who are really directly affected by it. And I've always respected the way that you model that and do that. And so I'm just giving props to that. So that was the core of what we wanted to do to jumpstart the conversation. And you'll also notice to all the folks in the audience that we intentionally didn't do this as a webinar format. We wanted it to be, it's risky because it literally takes only one of y'all to start Zoom bombing this place and just, but we realized that this couldn't really be a space of healing, of processing, of dialogue, if it's, the six of us and y'all just sort of anonymously throwing Q&As up there. So this is also your space. And so with all the dialogue that's been going on thus far, do any of y'all have questions? Do y'all have thoughts? Do you just need to process something right now? How are y'all doing? So you can either drop something in the chat if you're feeling comfortable and okay with it. You're more than welcome to unmute, start your video, and just engage in the dialogue, because you have some key actors and key supports in this really difficult time around campus and then also nationally. And so the floor is y'all's. If y'all, a lot of y'all came into this session, I think you came with a purpose. And even if you're not clear about that, let's dialogue about this. Let's talk about this. Because again, if we're all bottled up, healing, processing, it doesn't work that well. And maybe it's a lofty goal to try to hold space in that way in a Zoom format. But until we're fully open, this is the best that we can do. But there was that push because it is something that we were also hearing is really necessary. And both Dan and Ivy really heard that loud and clear and said, Monday, here's an idea. Tuesday, we formed the committee. Wednesday, we finished it and advertised it. So anything that folks have in the audience.
While we wait for someone to ask a question, I would like to say how unusual it was, this case was. We had seen Eric Garner killed on video. We had seen Philando Castile killed on video. We had seen Tamir Rice killed on video. So, and people who can go way back, remember Natasha Hollins being killed on video, and Rodney King being beaten on video. So there was nothing about this that we thought this was a gimme case, because Tamir Rice's murderer, he never even faced charges. He got fired by the Cleveland Police Department, and got another job in a police department right outside of Cleveland. Eric Garner's the person who killed him, the DA refused to even submit charges. Philando Castile's, we were told when we saw the actual video, instead of just his girlfriends, his fiancés, we'll understand what all was going on for the police officer. Then when the place was, when the case went all the way through, we saw the full video, and the video didn't tell us anything new. And I'll tell you, that was so strange when Philando Castile was killed, because it happened to be my birthday. And I woke up with the murder of Alton Sterling. And then I saw later in the day the killing of Philando Castile, and I couldn't even celebrate my birthday. It took everything to even, it was my first birthday with my daughter. my wife wanted to celebrate, and I was trying to celebrate, but I said, I just saw two brothers get killed. And, so when this came up, I sat and when they said that the verdict was in, until I heard 3 guilties, I thought he was going to be exonerated. I thought it was going to be a mixed verdict. I never thought he was actually, that Chauvin was actually going to be convicted of all charges. So that's why this was so different, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other part of it, I think, is that within the trial itself, you actually had police officers breaking rank, and that almost never ever occurs. It's almost, there's that thin blue line that you do not cross. But yes, Erica Galt has, I appreciate you throwing this in here, has broken the proverbial ice. It's always difficult with Q&A. So I'll ask this, and then anybody can chime in as you see fit. But you asked, can any of the panelists speak to the gender differences in victims of police brutality and the ways they address the care of students and communities dealing with this? I'm thinking of how Black women are currently reading and triggered by the death murder of Makia. And I apologize, I actually haven't heard someone say her name directly, so I'm doing my best phonetic pronunciation. And if anyone can correct me on that, please let me know. But yeah, there's a gendered component to it, to these police murders, but there's police killings, and then sometimes legally defined as murders. But it also says, there's also different issues in terms of how people are the gender differences in the way people are triggered by them, and also the care that's needed. So it's a wide open question. I'd love to hear what our panelists have to say about that.
I will start. Great question. Thank you for the question. We understand that the realities as it relates to gender around violence from authority, specifically looking at police and Black women, is something that has been part of our historical context, but not as explored. And when we think about that, it's not just when you think about the murders that we see on the video cameras, right, of the Breonna Taylor and what we saw this week. We also think about sexual assaults and violence in so many different ways that Black women experience at the hands of authority that aren't experienced in other communities. And so part of this context is understanding kind of what I talked about earlier, that hypervisibility, but invisibility, and how it reigns in our Black community, specifically for Black women, so much so than any other community. And for us, what we've done is center the work of our survivor advocates. So this week we are doing, next week and the week after, we are focusing on healing as it relates to women specifically through this process. And we're working with our survivor advocates. We have 2 speakers coming in to really hone in and focus on what that gender difference is. And when you look at the research and understand the capacity and the history that comes along with that, I went to the Commission on the Status of Women. I spoke today, and I talked to them about this book that I had. I received it in 1990. I was about 10 years old. And the foreword at that time was so powerful to me. And it says that Black women whose ancestors were brought to the United States beginning in 1619 have lived through conditions of cruelty so horrible, so bizarre, the women had to reinvent themselves. They had to find safety and sanctity inside themselves, or they would not have been able to tolerate those torturous lives. They had to learn to be self-forgiving quickly, for often their exterior exploits were at odds with their interior beliefs. Still, they had to survive as wholly and healthily as possible in an infectious and sick climate. It goes on to say that, and this was written by Maya Angelou, lives lived in such cauldrons are either obliterated or forged into impenetrable alloys. Thus, early on and consciously, Black women as reality become possibilities only to themselves. To others, they are mostly seen and described in the abstract, concrete in their labor, but surreal in their humanness. And what I took from that, even at the age of 10 years old, was not only seeing, like I said, the beauty and the context of those words, but then as I grew in my womanhood and I grew to understand the pain that was written there and expressed, I was able to say that at 20, right, I heard the pain. So at 10, I saw the beauty in the words. And at 20, I heard the pain because I had started to go through the same pain as a Black woman. And at 30, I began to understand the complexity of the pain and the complexity of how our relationship, both in authoritative places and spaces with police, is different from that of our men. And then at 40, I realized that the leaders that told their story, those Black women that paved the way for us and carried so much for us, that those are the true leaders. Like when I think about leadership and I think about the ability to thrive, and they talk about impenetrable allies and alloys, exactly, the reinvention and the possibility. So for us having to navigate that space differently, because again, that hypervisibility and invisibility, with the reason why we said say her name is because you saw it on the portrait of the negress. You have not said my name. I know that you know it. I know that you see it. I know that you hear it, but you need to say it so that you can humanize me. And that I'm not just another number. I'm not just another victim. I was and continue to be an important part of this community. And so for so long, that invisibility around our Black women, and even as we talk about sexual assault and violence at the hands of police, and as well as murders, is one of the things that has been glossed over. And so that's why we are creating that space intentionally for survivors in the next 2 weeks.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much, Ivy, for sharing that. And at the same time, I also just really appreciate you moving say her name from, in some ways it almost kind of devolved into a tagline, a hashtag that people weren't really thinking about. And the what you just said, it really helps recenter the reason, the purpose behind that. So I really, really appreciate that. Does anybody else care to chime in on the gendered component of it? I know that's a heck of a high bar to follow, but if there is a brave soul that would like to chime in.
Yeah, this is not a bar to follow at all, but I want to, of course, affirm, all that Ivy shared, and thank you for sharing in such a powerful but such a personal way too, but bringing in all of the voices that have continued to provide for many of us kind of that compass as we move forward. This idea of Black womanhood, or women of color. I mean, I think it's important for everyone who's in this space today to recognize that even the term women of color was penned by Black women activists trying to continue to engage and create space in very well-meaning spaces around activism, but continue to create invisibility around the unique struggles of being both Black and being a woman, being both Latinx and being a woman, right? Being Asian and being a woman, but specifically around the Black experience. And that's really why when we talk about even intersectionality and critical race theory, for some of you, especially students who might be learning about this, it's intended to continue to think about those intersections of identity and how critical it is to know that the kinds of oppressions that get compounded are particularly challenging. And I want to come back to something that was also asked in that question around what do we do for students at this time when there is both a sense of knowing that there's discussion, there's visibility, there's discussion about sexual assault while we also talk about other forms of violence, and there's still a need to provide space and to give our students flexibility. at Portland Community College, we did something that really was not very, very popular. And I'm sure that the University of Arizona has been finding ways to do this, maybe in departments in different ways and stages. But we pretty much sent a message out to all of our faculty around a couple of critical moments in our academic year and said, we need you to be flexible, no excuses, right? We need you to say, if today you can't study, today you can't learn, today you can't participate, it's okay. We understand why that may be. And here are options, because we also want you to know that this is still a community for you. And if this is where you are finding your community, we want to make space for that. But if this is not where you find your community, we want you to know that you are not going to be penalized by structures and systems that refuse to see you for who you are. And that was challenging. But the more that we did it, I mean, sadly, we had to do it more than once, but the more that we did it, the more we found that the community began to understand it. And it is now creating a sense of understanding and awareness that is really important for students who don't have the power and the authority to say to their faculty members, to administrators, I can't be present today. So that's a direction we're taking. And for any students that you know who need that space, we have to figure out how to help them articulate that. And we need to really stand in solidarity with them as faculty and administrators.
But what a novel concept, treating students like human beings and understanding that when there's trauma, it's really hard, if not impossible, to study. It's so weird how we get caught up in the logics of higher education and forget about the humanizing components of it. And in some respects, I think I would argue, and I'm sure that you probably are seeing this on the ground level, Tricia, that the more that we actually make it a humane space, actually people can learn better in it. So they're not mutually antithetical ideas, no matter how much fear may drive that. As faculty are like, no, they're just going to get out of doing their work. No, people need breaks in space to be able to do this. So, oh yes, Felicia, please, you can unmute or drop it in the chat, however you want. Please ask a question, process, whatever it is that you need in this space.
Yeah, so I actually have a couple of comments, but first, hello. My name is Felicia Tagaban. I'm a student at the U of A, and I just want to first and foremost say how appreciative I am for this panel, for this time. I think too often, and this might have already been said, I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner, but too often I think we're expected to show up in spaces as though nothing is going on. I think we're, expected to be professional, we're expected to participate, and sometimes even we're expected to turn our cameras on, right? When we don't feel like it, or when we're not present, or we can't be present. And I just really, really appreciate those among you who have, one, created the space, but two, also have allowed for folks to come into the space as they authentically are. And so I appreciate every one of you who has shared from their hearts with vulnerability and transparency about how they're doing in this time, because we're not all right. We're tired, and I think we need to acknowledge that more. We need to tell folks that that's where we're at. I think that's also true if we're leading or teaching or just being a grad assistant, like myself. I think it's important to share that with students, to let them know that. But secondly, I also want to say one way just to sort of follow up, Tricia, with what you shared is a cool example of how our faculty are doing that. In that Dr. Z. Nicolazzo is in the higher ed department here at the U of A, and she just recently looked at some of our assignments on the syllabus and basically said, let's renegotiate these assignments. Let's talk about what points you want to, give yourself for these assignments. I mean, we were able to indicate the weight, right, of the assignments. We can negotiate that. We did that at the beginning, and this is before a lot of this stuff was happening, but that was one practice. And then a second one that came up recently when she was seeing that not a lot of the assignments were coming in, including mine. I was having trouble doing things, but she basically took all the pressure off and she said, well, let's talk about the requirements for these assignments. Let's negotiate them. And so many of them were like written responses to works that we've been reading throughout the class. And basically she said, you can respond in a written response, and we can negotiate the length of that response. Or maybe you want to do something different than that. Maybe you want to co-author a piece, or maybe you want to respond in like video or in some other expressive form. Like the fact that we could negotiate the parameters of that assignment was something I've just never seen before. And I thought that was incredibly humanizing. And also it just really supported these words, right? Like we always say, oh, we have these practices that are humanizing and loving, and we're only here for the students, right? Like we all say these things, but I felt like that was truly put into practice in just those two examples. So I just wanted to share that here and just say how appreciative I am of folks that are doing work like that, including my other faculty member, Dr. Cabrera. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicia. And I'm sure you've already done this, but I'm so glad that you say that here. Please just make sure that Z knows that as well. It's the dangest thing. We say these glowing things about people behind their backs, and then we forget to tell it to their faces. Not saying you did that, but just saying, maybe I'm reflecting on my own shortcomings like that. So do we have any other questions? Because we have part of a chat. All right, well, I'm just gonna read this for people who didn't actually read it, and it'll lead to a larger question. This is from Mandy Jeremiah, one of our incredible doc students in the Center for Study of Higher Ed. Along with Felicia, we get to brag on students who are doing brilliant work. But she says, I don't know how to say this, but to our Black and African American colleagues, I'm praying for you and our community. And today I watched part of Dante Wright's funeral on TikTok, and I experienced a floodgate of emotions. I'm so sad, and I don't know how to help as an Indigenous woman, and other than create space in Native SOAR, which she co-runs and is awesome at, for students to process. I've been sad all day. And so first of all, I really appreciate you opening up space, because this is part of that healing process and part of that solidarity. But one thing I wanted to pose to the panel is that, especially, and it became particularly acute after the murders in Atlanta, that there seems to be this really high spike in solidarity across racial ethnic groups, that there have been conversations within Latinx communities about anti-Blackness in the community, and asking the question, how do we stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter? And folks within Indigenous and Native and Asian American communities also having those same conversations. But I've also seen beautiful reciprocity in the same way of, how, that when there are brown kids in cages, that's also an issue of the Black community, or that you all get the idea that we're all under this, we're all battling systemic racism collectively. And so I guess the question that I have to the group is, I could just be looking at this through rose-colored glasses, that the solidarity isn't, it's never where we want it to be, but it seems very hopeful, very possible. Are you experiencing it in the same way? And what do you see as the possibility of this cross-racial solidarity to really address systemic racism in the process?
I'm seeing, and I have not thanked Dan and Nolan for putting this together, and I definitely want to make sure I do that before we get out of here. I'm seeing some solidarity. I'm seeing it among my students. I'm seeing it in many ways online, because like when it was proposed that the 14th Amendment be changed to not allow Latinx children to become automatically citizens, I saw a huge response from the Black community that said that's sacrosanct, you don't mess with it. And that was written for us, but it was written for us, but for everybody to come after that. And And, you know, like, I mean, we had a president who didn't know that he couldn't executive order an amendment, but I mean, he had to be taught that you don't have the power to do that. But then when the attacks started going on I mean, I was hearing about the attacks on Asian students last semester, and students started contacting each other saying, do you need a ride from work? You know, like, so that you don't have, because you're from China, you don't have the transportation over here. And so they started voluntarily picking up each other. And so I started seeing these cross racial solidarities going on immediately. And I'm hoping that it's something that will continue, and not just because, okay, well, this is out of the news and this is out of the media, and now something else is going to take over the media, and that's going to take over the news cycle. I'm hoping that I mean, and actually, when I look back, I don't think it's going to end, because if we look at the 2012 election, that was the first time that a president had been elected without a majority, without a white majority. And it's because like it took white people, Black people, Asians, Latinos, all to come together and do this. So I think this is a solidarity that may have been going on for years. It's just becoming recognizable because it's such an extreme time. And I'm hoping that we see this progress, and along with natives. I mean, Biden does not win Arizona without the Navajo Nation. Like, it doesn't happen. And not to make this all political, but it just showed what happens when different groups start to come together, and if they work together. And so I think it's going to be something that's going to continue on, because it's been going on since at least 2012. So I'll let somebody else jump in.
And that's a really important point too. We shouldn't have to wait for extreme acute violence and trauma to occur in order for us to come together, because that's how we become proactive in addressing this instead of reactive. But we're on that cusp. So are there any other thoughts about different modes of solidarity that people have been seeing, experiencing? Any thoughts on that at all? Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry, I'd be remiss, I've totally spaced. I want to also welcome with open arms Don Demps, Dr. Don Demps, within that was a week ago. Oh, really proud of the work that she's doing, and so excited to have her as a colleague in educational policy studies and practice. Just an absolutely incredible scholar and community activist, but family-oriented, anti-racist community activist. So actually, why am I doing this? Don, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much.
Got ahead of myself there.
No worries. My name is Dawn Demps. I am a Flint, Michigan native. I got my PhD from Arizona State University in education evaluation, education policy and evaluation. And my particular interest is in how communities, especially the African-American Black community, responds to different exclusionary and prejudicial actions inside of school systems and institutions in general, right? And then how those institutions respond. And it's really interesting that the day that I defended my dissertation, I got a phone call from a mother talking about something happening at a local school district that evening. By the next day, I was speaking to another parent from that same school district, looking at a school district pretty much wanting to take back their equity statement and maybe reworking it so it could be more palatable to everyone else. So those are the sorts of things that I'm interested in, connecting it to what we're seeing happen here. I mean, at the end of the day, it is absolutely about policy. And one way we move policy is through coalition building. So that's definitely necessary work, not knowing exactly what the question was before I came in. But I would like to add that this is not, I don't think that this is a unique moment, because we've seen this before, right? We've had these strong coalitions before where we've been able to move things, and we've inspired each other and learned from each of our own struggles. I do not think that they are the same struggles, but they are all connected to the same artery of white supremacy. So hopefully we'll stay on that path and continue to build up these coalitions for the benefit of everyone. And now I'm jumping off. I'm going to listen and ask any questions.
I'm going to have you jump right back on, because we've so I just wanted to piggyback off of this, more of a follow-up question, and it's the one that I sent you earlier. But so, I mean, you already talked about your work and the activism, but in some ways, and this is, again, this is my more armchair theorizing, you're the expert in this area. Do you see, is there possibility for critical anti-racist grassroots organizing, grassroots activism to actually be a form of self-care? Like, do you see, or community care? Like, how do you see, we had a beautiful conversation about self-care earlier, moving beyond going to the spa, which was just awesome, the way you're talking about culture and community, family. But, you know, all too often it's like, I need self-care to recover from being an activist, but is there some self-care embedded in activism itself?
Yeah, so I think there can be. The group of women that I followed for my dissertation, the space that they created, like this this fugitive space that they created, where they planned and they organized and they figured out how they were going to push back against policies that were being created and all these other things, was also a space where they prayed, which was a space where they brought their families, so kids were always welcome. Was a space where they yelled and they cried. They talked about, like, one of the first meetings they ever had, they spent 2 hours yelling. And for them, that was cathartic. And then they were able to come back. And I think so often we're told that, you know, don't yell, don't show anger, keep it in, because they won't listen to you otherwise. But we've all heard about the righteous anger that is necessary and the fury that we have to let out, and that we see sometimes in the streets being let out. So there has to become, I think that these organizing spaces can become those places where that happens. And then also, like, our indigenous healing practices, like I said, these mothers prayed, these mothers brought in pictures and talked about their family histories even before I started collecting their family histories. And that was all the way that they empowered and enriched themselves to remind themselves of why they do this work, right? And that there were people who may have had it worse than them, but people who also, like, moved the needle some. And so in that way, I think that organizing spaces can be healing spaces.
Wow. And I love the way that you reframed anger. I was reminded also, looping back to what Ivy was saying earlier with Maya Angelou, because Maya Angelou said, you know, if you're not angry, you're either a stone or you're too sick to be angry. When these human conditions are inhumane, that's a natural human response to it. So I appreciate that reframing. So I only have one last question for the panel, and you can answer it in whatever order. Just know that we are running a little short on time, so try to keep it succinct, but it's also a really complicated question. And that is, Keith Ellison, when he came out and as the Attorney General in Minnesota, he said that the conviction is not justice, that's accountability. And a lot of people have been replaying that, reframing that, and saying, yeah, even though it's talking about the justice system, you know, it's the way that Malcolm X talked about, you don't stab the knife in 9 inches, pull it out 6 and call that progress, or call it justice. You don't pull it out all the way and call it justice. It's only when the healing occurs that justice occurs. And so for your perspective, what would justice be? Like, what kind of movement towards justice do we need to go off of this? What would justice look like?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, only because I'll start from the perspective of, again, you know, what's happening in Portland and what's happening in Oregon, but I think particularly in Portland. The challenges that we've really had in terms of the recognition that it's the system, it's the structural origins of law enforcement and all forms of state enforcement around community law enforcement versus community health and safety. That is really our problem. And I will name specifically, in the last 24 months, we've had a Black woman as our police chief. We've had a white identified woman as a police chief, and now a Black identified man as police chief. And we continue to have the exact same conflict and pain and brutality that is happening even in our own community. It is the structure and the system. And there's not a lot of understanding around this idea of defunding or abolition. But what is emerging, at least, and I think this is such a beautiful thing that we need to continue to get our community involved in. There has been a commission in the city of Portland for some time looking at police accountability. That needs to continue. And we need to broaden who's involved in those conversations. But I think that justice will really be served when we completely think about community health and safety in a different way. And we're beginning to pilot for the first time a different kind of response unit that is going to be the first unit that is called when there are issues in the community. So we're not going to necessarily have a police officer come and respond when you have a disturbance, when that disturbance has been identified as there is not what may appear to be an immediate threat to the community. And even that needs to continue, of course, to be evaluated. But tremendous gratitude for some of our commissioners and the community organizers who have pushed to finally have the city of Portland at least launch this parallel unit. And I hope that in a year, that parallel unit will actually be the unit that is oftentimes called upon when we need to talk about public health and community safety. But I think that that would really be justice in this instance. So
There we go.
I would,
Justice is what. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I had mentioned earlier that Carrie O'Horn, if people are not familiar with her, she was the one who lost her pension several years ago because she had stopped she was a Buffalo police officer. She stopped her partner from choking a man to death. And like I said, I graduated from high school with her. And so I saw her struggle. And in Buffalo, they've made Carriel's law, they made it a law now that you have to have intervention if you see your partner breaking the law and killing someone, harming someone. And I think that needs to become nationwide, because when we talked about the blue wall of silence before, she broke it. I think one of the biggest problems was it was a she that broke it. We didn't want you as a Black woman on the force anyway, and then you're going to start talking about what we did, what we're doing wrong. She lost her pension. She lost everything. She lost her house. I once again, I know her. I saw her to the point where she was driving taxis. I saw her evicted from public housing, and she had no idea where she was going to go. And so after that 13-year struggle to see her actually regain her pension and back pay was beautiful to see. But for justice to start happening, it needs to be something. There needs to be real accountability on from the police departments. We need, people say they need proper training. They need a whole new system of what policing is. I used an example with my wife earlier. I used to vacuum the floor, and my mother would say, did you vacuum the floor? Of course I did, Ma. How'd you vacuum the floor and you didn't move one chair? You didn't move one table, but you claim that the floor is vacuumed. And that's what we're doing. We keep on trying to fix a system by not moving the furniture. Like, we're going to leave everything in place and say that the system is fixed. We need to start moving some things around and actually fix a system countrywide. You know, so we don't have situations that just happened this week in New Jersey, where some black young men were riding their bikes. They rode their bikes out of one township into another, got arrested. One got arrested, and all of them got their bikes confiscated because in this town you have to be registered. Your bike has to be registered to ride it, but in this town it's not necessary. So we need some federal laws to start. So it's not just every town is a different district in a police department, and you know, like, and that town will enforce the laws however they want to. And I can talk forever on this, so I'm gonna give it up to somebody else, because all of a sudden the passion is getting out of me. So let me give it up to somebody else and go mute.
Atari, I'll take over from that passion, because I lost a father to injustice. And I'll tell you what, just like George Floyd's family, you will never get justice. You will go to your grave angry. No millions and billions settlement or feeling hurt or getting things on the press or a movement will take away that raw pain. But I think it could lead to good, right? And so personally, I don't believe in justice. I think justice looks backwards. And justice assumes there was a golden age that never existed in our country's history and doesn't exist today. And so to go back and to call for justice, what does that even look like? I think and I think this is what Natari and Trisha are talking about. We're talking about freedom. And I think this is coming together, whether you are a Native American, Latinx, Asian, Black, white, like we need to come up with a new reality and stop looking to the past. We'll never get revenge. The wounds run too deep across our ancestors. And I think in that case, you know, yes, absolutely what Natari and Trisha mentioned, we have structural problems. We have the militarization of the police. We have the industrial prison complex. We have embedded racism. It's so embedded. And so I think that's why, regardless of your skin color, because this is such a diverse group, we all have a role to play in the structural injustice that Don had talked about earlier. Did you know, so this is because this is part of GEL, did you know there are countries in the world where police do not have guns? I counted 19. And did you know that the UK is one of them? And did you know it's not because it's lawless, it's because the public doesn't have guns, right? What would this country look like? We don't have to have guns, right? Maybe we need to defund the police, but maybe we also need to demilitarize the police as well. So I think we need to dream big and dream together.
That's beautiful. Would anybody like to follow up off of that?
So she pretty much said a lot of what I wanted to say. I just want to add to that. I think that oftentimes in the language that we use about justice, I think really what people want to say is restoration, right? So we can never have a restoration of a life. That will never happen. And I think that we have shown time and time again that the system, whether it's judicial system or school systems, have become comfortable with putting a dollar value on whatever trauma and suffering that is endured, right? And saying, okay, now we're done, we've paid you, go on ahead, be gone. But there's things you can't recover from. There's things you can't reform. So absolutely, justice is the way we tend to use it is about punishment. It's about revenge. What we want is freedom. Exactly. We want to embrace freedom dreams. And I think it's hard for us to even imagine, which is why it's so hard for people to grasp the idea of living in a society without police officers, without them having a gun, right? Like we can't even imagine that. So we don't even have the freedom dreams to give you the answer to what does justice look like or freedom look like, because we don't know, because we've all been so programmed into the system. So after George Floyd, again, I hate to repeat anything that's already been said. I feel like I was put back underwater when Micaiah was murdered. When this 16-year-old girl who's defending herself in a street fight, and being someone who comes from the hood, I've been jumped. I know what it is. And you telling me that police would have just came up and just shot me 4 times, body mass, head on, right? That's problematic. That's extremely problematic. So we have to go beyond these like non-reformist reforms, these little stair step things that we do to hold people off for now. But this is not really about freedom. It's not really about abolition of any type. And I think we need to take it a step further.
Well, I think that's an absolutely perfect note to end on. So if you wouldn't mind, the audience, join me in you can unmute your mics, and please give a big round of applause to the people who organized, presented here. This was just beautiful what you all put together. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for, because you're not only offering your brilliance, but you're offering healing space as well. And very rarely does that occur anywhere, but especially within institutions of higher education. So just all the love and respect to y'all for creating this space in this way. Ivy to jump starting it, Dan to doing a lot of the organizing all the way around, and understanding how critically important it is to not wait next week, the week after. This is something that had to happen now, and realizing the pressure to do that. Thank you all for rising to the occasion on such short notice, and just offering so much care in this space. It was such an honor to be able to facilitate this conversation. So thank you so much for that. So with that, Dan and Ivy, close us out, and whatever you need to do.
I want to give Ivy the space to do the closing remarks.
We heard a lot today, and it was a lot to digest, like Erica said in the chat. But as we close today and we think about the next steps in a post-George Floyd world, I want you to ask yourself, was this societal guilt or societal shift? It's important to think about whether we're feeling guilty or we really are shifting towards an inclusive world where my humanity outweighs whatever was in my system or a $20 bill, that my humanity outweighs when we talk about the difference between the juxtaposition of guilt and justice. I also didn't find justice because for me, it felt like it was societal guilt. And I'm hoping that it will be the societal shift. One of the things very quickly that Will Smith said is that, you know, this is not new. Racism is not new. These things are not new. We're capturing it. But I challenge you to know that we have been capturing this since 1619. After George Floyd was killed, my father called me in tears. And he said, I am so sorry that you have to live through this. I thought we fought enough for you not to see what I saw. He said, I would never look up at a white woman when I was walking down the street when I lived in Arkansas, because I saw one of my friends hanging from a tree for doing that. And I didn't think and want you to have to experience that and to see. And for him, he said, this was just the same lynching in the same capacity as he saw as a child. So it's not that it's new that we're filming it. We have pictures of the lash, we have pictures of lynching, we have pictures of concentration camps. The question is, are you ready for a societal shift? So the jury did their part. They did what they're supposed to do. Will you? That's when we'll see change. That's when we can reimagine the idea of policing, so that we don't have to think about when I get pulled over, should I call my mom and say goodbye? You have to do your part, and we'll do ours.
Thank you, Sister Ivy.
Thank you all, and thank you all for your contributions to this panel. It was amazing. If you want to get in contact with anybody, please contact me, and I can get you contacted with anybody if we want to further this conversation. And that's what it is furthering this conversation. So to kind of jump on everything, I think in the words of Dr. Galt, let's start moving some furniture. So let's start moving some furniture. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.